About where everyone else is as people arrive, I'm just going to moan about the fact that it is far too hot here in Edinburgh. And I think personally that our three panelists, who've all spent a lot of time working on climate change and failing to stop it, are personally responsible for that. And I've been, as a result of the heat over the last 2 weeks, kept up every night by our poor baby who can barely sleep. And so if you're all like me, a little bit grumpy about the weather, then you're to blame. And you might think it's the big businesses who've been mining fossil fuels and billionaires and profiting from driving climate crisis over the last century. But tonight I'm going to encourage you to blame our three wonderful panelists whose failure to personally stop the climate crisis is getting my ire. That's not fair. We are going to get going in a second delivery. Are we ready to go? Or are we still waiting for people to join? I shall assume that we're ready. Okay, great. Well, welcome everyone to this week's Open Democracy live discussion. As you may have got from my grouchy grumbles, we are talking about the climate crisis, specifically is COP26 humanity's make or break moment on climate breakdown? So this year's COP26 meeting is one of the big ones. So every year there's a kind of big global UN conference on climate change, happens around November and December. Every few years they kind of negotiate what the individual targets are. So you might remember the Paris Agreement in 2015, which was a lot of fun, and lots of us spent a lot of time running around Paris reporting on that. And this year it was going to be last year, but kind of delayed by the pandemic, but this year it's going to be in Glasgow, which is in Scotland where I am. And so the question is, is this going to be a big opportunity? And I think we probably know what our panelists are going to say, but I will let them say it themselves. First, we have Kate Aronoff, who is zooming in. Presumably you're calling us from the States, Kate. Where are you specifically?
I am indeed. I'm in Brooklyn, New York.
You're in Brooklyn. You probably don't remember this, but we met very briefly outside a bar in Brighton.
I do remember that.
Oh, well, nice to see you again. And Kate is the author of a new book, which is Overheated, How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back. I should say, by the way, that I'm here in lieu of Laurie McFarlane because Laurie's had a kind of family emergency, so I've been sort of pulled in last minute. But Kate is going to be, she's a staff writer at the New Republic, and I'm going to repeat her book again because you should clearly buy it. It's called Overheated, How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back. I'm going to ask us questions first. We've got Mathew Lawrence. Hi, Mathew, founder and director of Commonwealth, which is a think tank that designs ownership models for a democratic and sustainable economy, and is the author of Planet on Fire, a manifesto for the age of environmental breakdown, which you should also get. And also, you had a cracking report out just today, didn't you, Matt?
Yeah, we just today had a report out on sort of mapping who owns the fossil fuel assets of the North Sea. So there's about 1,500, which tells you the problem already, but there's about 1,500 existing licenses for oil and gas extraction in UK territorial waters. And we've mapped who owns it, who's profiting from it, and how deep and systemic the problem is. So you can find that on Commonwealth's website, which I'll put in the chat.
And I'm really glad you're doing this, because I was beginning to look into the question of the North Sea recently, and I was like, oh my god, someone's got to map who owns this whole thing, because it's like very, very untransparent. It's a nightmare. It's entirely unaccountable. And I was just beginning to talk to some financial journalists about how you might do it when Laurie, who would meant to be here today, said, I think the Commonwealth are doing that. So instead I rang Corey Miriam, and she was like, yeah, we're doing that. So thanks for doing that work. It means that we didn't have to.
Happy assistance.
I'm sure that we will chat about that shortly. And we've got Harpreet Paul, who is a PhD researcher on climate justice at Warwick Law School, and author of the recently released report Towards Reparative Climate Justice, From Crises to Liberations, and also co-editor of the illustrated book Perspectives on a Global Green New Deal. And Harpreet and I used to do some work together when you were at People from Planet back in the day, and it's lovely to see you in your new role. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. And how is fatherhood treating you?
It's wonderful. I'm very much enjoying having a baby, although it does make all of this stuff a little bit more real. And so, yeah, nice to see you all. So let's crack on with our chat. Kate, I'm going to come to you first. Apparently the 29th of July, which is today, is Earth Overshoot Day, which marks the date when humanity's demand for ecological resources and services in a given year exceeds what the Earth can regenerate in that year. Can you tell us a bit about how it is that capitalism broke the planet, as the title of your book suggests?
Sure. Yeah. So, I went back and forth with my editor and, in my own head a little bit about what to subtitle the book, which is, I think, the most fraught part of any book writing process is fighting with your editor and their higher ups about things that go on the cover. Anyways, there was a bit of a debate about whether to say capitalism broke the planet or neoliberalism broke the planet. And we ended up going with capitalism because it describes a sort of more holistic system, right, than neoliberalism, which is a set of rules essentially by which capitalism can operate. But what's important about capitalism, right, is that there's this endless drive for expansion, which historically, my book talks a lot about the United States and the way this is played out there, but historically has meant exploiting land and people, right, to grow private wealth. That is the history of the country where I am now, premised as it is on genocide and slavery that built, this great wealth, the most wealthy country this world has ever known. And that logic, as we've seen sort of, horrifically over the last several decades, is incompatible, right, with, I think, a sort of moral world, but also with planetary well-being, right? We know, right, that capitalism needs to continue to find new frontiers, and fossil fuels itself are sort of premised on that, right? We burn through these finite but very, very abundant resources of fossil fuels, and there are more, there's more coal, oil, and gas than we can put up into the atmosphere. We're not going to, run out of oil like people thought in the 1970s, but we will run out of space, right, in our atmosphere to fill with carbon dioxide before we tip over into these sort of catastrophic effects of climate change, which, folks all over the world are experiencing right now, whether that's landslides in India, extreme heat waves in the Pacific Northwest, like we've seen in the last couple of weeks, wildfires, right? There is, a really sort of direct incompatibility between this sort of logic of endless expansion, which is built into capitalism, and, continuing to live sort of healthy and abundant lives on this planet. I can stop there. And, I think what's important, I'll just say briefly about neoliberalism, which seems relevant to a discussion about COP26, is that the set of rules that capitalism that has governed the sort of capitalism that we've lived in, certainly in the US and UK, which were not the first, but were laboratories for these policies in starting most aggressively in the 1980s, but before then too. Is that it really constrains our imaginations about the types of policies which are possible to deal with the climate crisis, right? So very common sense things like strict regulation, public ownership, the sort of destructive project of neoliberalism took those things off the table and injected a really radical set of ideas, right, about how capitalist economies should be governed, that left several decisions up to the market, privatized many functions, but expanded the parts of the state we don't need, right, the parts that incentivize fossil fuel production, that build our militaries out, that expand carceral states. These are all things which are directly harmful in very material ways, but also present this real contradiction between with being able to deal with the crisis. So I can stop there, ramble about that for as long as you want.
Well, I'm sure we'll come back to it, but that's a very clear answer. Thank you, Kate. And I think we're going to come to Matt next. So Matt, in your book, you talk about how climate breakdown is interlinked with multiple curses, from the rise of the far right to growing inequality and COVID-19. Can you tell us a bit about where the environmental crisis fits into these wider dynamics?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think in some ways it's, if you take the far right, if you take some of the sort of reaction to COVID and sort of hierarchy of human worth that's kind of been like projected onto it, I think there's a lot of sort of overlaps there. And I think environmental breakdown sort of supercharges that. Of course, this has been processes that are not just decades old, but centuries, and they go back to those dynamics that Kate has mentioned of it, extraction, expansion, enclosure, the violent accumulation of resources, and then sort of through that, that hierarchy of human worth, the sort of subjection of nature and labor to extractive processes. And I think, when we look at COVID, we should see it's not necessarily, unless the CIA is going to tell us that it came out of a sort of lab in 5 years' time. But if it didn't, what we should see COVID as is in some ways a symptom of these, centuries-long processes of the entanglement and destruction of nature through accumulation, because COVID arose out of sort of the sort of humanity's sort of enclosure of food systems, deforestation, etc., etc. And of course, when we talk about humanity, we mean the upper echelons of not just the top 10%, but really the top 1, 2, 3%. So I think there's these are all deeply interlinked. And I think it's important to think of these as sort of multiple and intersecting and reinforcing crises rather than things that we can sort of siphon off. So the crisis of the carceral state is not sort of something you can siphon off from the crisis of environment, which is not something you can siphon off from inequality crises. So I think it's very much interlinked. It's very much sort of historical and structural. And I think to sort of try and sort of locate it a bit more real, I mean, Kate mentioned the neoliberal sort of constructs. I mean, I think a really interesting example that was in the news, I think 2 days ago, was rock copper exploration. I don't know if people have heard of this, but it's a UK-based company that bought sort of a license off the Adriatic coast in Italian sort of waters. In some ways, the idea that sort of waters can be sort of a country's territories in itself quite strange. But anyway, Italian waters. And the Italian parliament recently banned offshore drilling, and now the Italian government is being sued for multiple millions of euros by this company, which says, well, actually, no, like we have, property has primacy over people and planet, essentially, is the governing logic. And that, our needs, the interests of our investors and shareholders comes prior to everyone else. And that really, encapsulates that sort of sense that neoliberalism is sort of a structure that insulates, the economic from the political and the ability of democracies to reorder our societies for human flourishing. So I think that's kind of sort of, a brief guide through some of those things, but a lot to discuss.
Lots to discuss, and we've got plenty of time still to come back to all of that, but I'm going to nip on to Harpreet. So thank you for that, Matt. We'll come back to you in a moment. But Harpreet, as I was saying, lovely to see you again. And today the UN reported that the world's wealthiest 1% account for more than twice the combined carbon emissions of the poorest 50%. Can you talk a bit about the global dimensions of the climate crisis and why action must be global?
Yeah, and I think one of the challenging things for those of us that are based in the global north is that most of us, whether we would identify ourselves as those in the top 10% that are disproportionately contributing to emissions, are in fact disproportionately contributing to emissions. So the average person in the UK in the first 2 weeks of this year emitted more CO2 than people in 7 countries in the African continent combined will in a whole year. And so what we're talking about is huge, huge disparities. And when you think about climate change impacts, they're most clear when you take these things like trade agreements and neoliberalism together. And I'll just give an example of Mozambique, who a country that was subjected to intense forms of colonial violence by British and Portuguese influences, forced labour, extraction of resources, and fast forward 2019, experienced 2 incredibly strong and unprecedented storms causing billions in damage. It's also a country that has had industrial agriculture enforced in it through World Bank policies that are promoting a kind of development that's totally antithetical to the direction that we need to be going in. It's had loans imposed on it, resulting in a situation where the country is often paying back in interest more than it's investing in resilient housing, in healthcare, in the basic things that we need to be able to both withstand health shocks and economic shocks, but also to be able to withstand the climate change impacts that countries in the global south are least responsible for. And the UN Environment Programme is estimating that just to be able to adjust to the impacts of climate change in the global south, you need something like 70 billion US dollars a year. And one of the things that will come up at COP26 is this issue of climate finance, because it goes to the heart of equity when thinking about those that have been disproportionately responsible for emissions. Between 1850 and 2002, the global north emitted 3 times as many greenhouse gas emissions compared to the global south, and the majority of people, 85% of the people on the world, live in the global south. So we're talking about huge inequities that countries in the global north said in Copenhagen that they were committed to addressing through forms of climate finance. And instead, what we've seen is a kind of neoliberal approach to climate finance, where countries are saying, sure, we'll give you this £20 million loan at market interest rates. So essentially profiting from injustice. And that's all highlighting how these loans, forms of development, neoliberalism, and this incentive to profit is exacerbating the deep injustices that countries in the South are facing.
Yeah, thank you, Harpreet. And I think it's really striking for me, how long we've been saying this and how much it's still true. And that it's easy to get depressed about that, but I'm going to try to avoid that. I think my next question for everyone, I've kind of got 2, and I'm going to put them in this order. We've had a lot of questions submitted by people across the country and around the world who are joining us. And I think that for me, they can kind of be summed up, well, not all of them, but a lot of them can be summed up in the sense which Matt kind of touched on, of total distrust of our current political structures. And I suppose for me, one of the products of neoliberalism, which Kate talked about, is a total distrust in politics and the state. And that arrives at a time when, because of the climate crisis, it's kind of clear that we need to have trust in expertise with science and in states in some form or other in order to deliver some kind of change. And how do we navigate the difference between those things? The way that I'm going to get the exact form of words that someone wrote down, because I enjoyed it a lot, but lots of people ask similar questions to this. But the question is from Stephen Mandel, and it's, how can we best put enough pressure on our craven politicians to get radical change at COP? But I think that, in the context of deep distrust about politics produced from neoliberalism, how do we get the change that we need? And I'm going to come to Matt first, and then Kate and Harpreet. So Matt, what are your thoughts on the broad kind of political crisis, neoliberalism, and how that interacts with the climate crisis?
Yeah, I think this is in some ways the question, in that the climate crisis is a multifaceted crisis, and there's multiple elements of it. But I think above all, it's a political crisis. It's not a crisis of like, do we have the resources to finance this? It's not one of like, do we have the technical or technological ability? Really, it's a question of, can we mobilize the power and sustain the momentum for a sort of sustained dismantling of the citadels of fossil capital and sort of the intermediaries that sort of clog up the arteries around that, and sort of break through the inertia of the current sort of carbon capitalism that we have. And so really that is in some ways the sort of the question, like, how do we sort of sustain this, if a just transition is ultimately about social struggle and power more than technical questions? How do we sort of mobilize and then sustain the multiple heterogeneous of coalitions we're going to need to break through? And I guess there's certainly no one silver bullet, and I think it'll depend on context and place. But I think certainly some things that would in some ways some things that sort of the neoliberals in the sort of 70s and 80s did, we can perhaps learn from, albeit in radically different directions. But certainly around aggressive antagonism and sort of real sort of highlighting of who are the entrenched rentier and fossil interests that are sort of basically destroying our futures, and not even our futures for hundreds of millions of people now, who are literally sort of ecocidal assault on humanity and the planet right now. So I think there's like that real highlighting of who are the opposition. I think there's a sort of second need to sort of build a majoritarian coalition about like how, and this is the great virtue of a just transition, how life would be better, it would be healthier, it would be freer, it would be more abundant. So how do we actually sort of articulate that? I think prefiguration is quite important, because I think, as you touched on, Adam, the tragedy, the sort of tragedy of neoliberalism is that it exactly as we need to sort of re-enchant politics, re-strengthen democratic power, neoliberalism has acted to basically neutralize and neuter politics as a sort of collective vehicle. So that's that's a real bind. But I think prefiguring at a local level, whether that's municipal cities that can bring in free electric transport, whether that's sort of international forms of solidarity, even if it's just between trade unions to begin with and then expand out. How can we begin to prefigure the type of emancipated and decarbonized futures in institutions, in places, in geographies? And I think through those type of exercises, we can begin to kind of re-knit together a sense that actually collective action does have the power and capability to sort of transform our trajectory.
Thanks, Matt. And Kate, I mean, for those of us sort of in the UK watching the dynamics that we experience here unfolding in the States as well, where obviously you have much more power as a nation than we do, how can you, as a climate movement there, kind of navigate that crisis of politics as you limp out of the Trump era and into this sort of slightly confused space of the Biden era, and have to confront, you have space to kind of breathe and catch your breath. You've got climate emergency in this major COP in December to deal with.
Yeah, no, we're in very different national contexts, maybe more so than the last couple of years, and we both had right-wing governments and sort of ascendant electoral left projects. So we find ourselves in a different place. And the Biden administration is a strange one to be in. And I won't ramble along too much about it, but the sort of generation of climate activists who've grown up, from Occupy Wall Street, some people in the Sunrise Movement are too young to remember even that, have grown up doing politics really in the Trump administration, or I'm like at the kind of like older range of the youth climate movement, right? I'm 29, but there's very little sort of like cultural memory of the Obama administration, right? When we had some quite similar dynamics, right? And unfortunately, we've seen some of those repeat themselves, giving the Biden administration a real pass for the first several months. Obviously, it's not in an ideal situation, a 50-50 split in the US Senate, with a party that, a Republican Party that is hell-bent against anything called climate policy, and acknowledging that Democrats can win national elections is where the Republican Party is at right now. It's just full bore against democracy, and we've seen some sort of acknowledgement, right, by the White House that of the strength of the climate movement over the last several years. We've certainly seen line items and proposed and spending packages that we would not have seen, is talking about the climate crisis as an existential threat. That's, we've seen, progress from the Obama administration that should be noted, but we're still a very, very long way off from, fulfilling the United States' historical responsibility to the climate crisis. And that, is really unfortunately, and this is, sounds very pessimistic, but I think any progress we've seen so far from the White House, A, is rhetorical, right? We haven't passed climate policy yet. We still don't have comprehensive climate policy in the United States. B, is entirely focused within our territorial borders, right? Within the bounds of the United States. And there's very little talk about climate finance, very little talk about, paying our fair share for the climate crisis, right? The U.S. in particular is responsible for 40% of excess emissions since the industrial age. That is an enormous debt that we have to pay back to the rest of the world, whose wealth, again, we have stolen in the form of land and resources, right? And so that is a very far off conversation from happening. I don't think there's a route toward dealing with that, which does not run through small d, and in our case, big D democratic majorities, having a sort of climate populism that can encourage people to see the benefits of climate policy in their own lives. In the United States, right, the thing that we've been very bad at in this country, and talking about, carbon pricing and these sort of technocratic tweaks around the edges, that is starting to shift in no small part thanks to social movements, but I do think we're still a bit far off from that. I just want to I fixated, and this is sort of a nitpicky, annoying thing to do, but it was fixating on the very end part of that question, which is, how do we make change at COP26, right? Which is sort of what we're talking about, and I think that's very hard. In the book, I talk a little bit about the sort of prehistory, right, leading up to the beginning of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, by which point this sort of more radical democratic vision for what the United Nations could be put forward by folks and formations like the New International Economic Order, a sort of collection of states which had won their liberation from colonial rule, that was stamped out of existence, in no small part thanks to my government, right? And so by the time we get even to that point of having a global conversation about how to take on this crisis, hopes for sort of a global democracy have been stamped out, right? And that means that the UNFCCC is a very weak body, and my government in particular, through Democratic and Republican administrations, has sought to beat back its power even more, right? The Kyoto Protocol would have been a binding international agreement, holding countries to bring down their emissions in the global north in particular, and to put real resources toward decarbonization. Not that it was perfect, I'm not going to defend the Kyoto protocols to the end of days, but because the United States chose to withdraw from that under the Bush administration, we got the Paris Agreement, which is a bottom-up process, quote unquote, right, that relies on these voluntary commitments that countries, as study after study has shown since the Paris Agreement was negotiated, we're very far off from meeting, right? That we are just very far off, and there's no sort of binding enforcement mechanism to keep us to that. And that power, those sorts of real rulemaking abilities lie within things like the Energy Charter Treaty, which Matt talked about, right? The ability of energy companies to sue sovereign governments if they threaten their profits, right? That is where power is held in the global economy, and that is a real problem, to think about how to deal with the climate crisis. And I think there is a lot of I think the UN climate talks are a real exciting space, can be a really exciting space for international solidarity, for building connections between North and South. I've learned a tremendous amount getting to interview folks in climate justice struggles from around the world. But I do think real power is held simply elsewhere, right? That's not to say that there shouldn't be a lot of democratic engagement at COP26. That's absolutely necessary. But we know the real power in the global economy is bound up in trade agreements, is bound up in these sort of thicket of international rules which protect corporate and fossil fuel profits.
Thanks, Kate. Yeah, and I'm going to come to more chat about COP and what you want to describe as COP skepticism in a minute. But Harpreet, I'm going to go back to the question I was asking Matt before to you, which is, how do we navigate this kind of climate crisis at such a time of deep political crisis and deep distrust in a sense, any kind of institution, including particularly states and democracy?
I've been reflecting on this question quite a bit, not least because with colleagues Andy Taylor and Louise Hazan have just co-founded a new organization hoping to kind of intervene on this question called Tipping Point. But what we're really hoping to do through that is both identify the levers of financial capital through very strategic coordinated campaigns. So there's already a lot of energy focused on Barclays and HSBC for their role in investing in and propping up the fossil fuel infrastructure through globally, but also specific asset managers. And I know Commonwealth have done some great research on this as well, and insurance company like Lloyd's of London. And Lloyd's of London is a particularly interesting case too, because it played a huge role in insuring slave ships and goes to the root of what we identify when we talk about a system that's built on treating certain people as less than and viewing land as a resource to extract from. But how can we use these moments of strategic interventions to really bring people to tip a specific actor to do something differently? And more than that, as part of running a strategic campaign in relation to a particular financial actor, really build a people's momentum, because yes, power is held by corporations, it is held by states, but it's also held in our communities. And I think that going back to a way of being in community and coming together through collective action is something that many of us have lost in periods of time of maybe going to one protest to another. But how can we build a sense of community agency in that we're collectively building the world that we want to build? And I also think that there's work to be done here in the stories that we tell around how the same systems of financial capital that are involved in propping up the fossil fuel industry are the same systems that are causing impoverishment within the UK, and what would it mean to address those in a way that's transformative for people within the UK and globally too. And then I think Matt talked about global solidarity as well in this context, where it's really difficult to engage with the government that we have on this when they've reduced their development aid and engaged in forms of aid that are very unhelpful, like supporting the privatization of education and supporting gas and other initiatives up until the end of last year at least. How can we do that global solidarity work in a way that builds community wealth here? And there's been some really interesting projects on community wealth building that's about procuring locally, building wealth within areas around Manchester, elsewhere. And I think that there's something in leveraging public procurement within areas within the UK that are committed to upholding international labour organisation standards and human rights standards, and actually leveraging the power that we can within communities to say we're committed to improving people's lives here, and through the goods that we purchase, whether they're electric vehicles or laptops, ensuring that what we're procuring isn't causing harm further down the supply chain.
Thanks, Harpreet. I am going to, there's a whole load of questions that have come in from the audience. I've also got a couple more questions for myself. And I kind of jump around between them with each of you. And I'm gonna go to Matt first again, and then we'll just keep chatting. Matt, firstly, just people in the UK, I wonder if you could just quickly, just aware that you have just launched a report that's about North Sea oil. And you know, there's a kind of clear contrast as we're talking about big global climate conference coming here to Scotland. And where I'm sitting, you know, from my flat, I can walk down and see the North Sea. I can sometimes see the rigs coming in, and they're talking about opening up new oil fields in the North Sea. And how do we kind of navigate and understand that space, the contrast on the one hand between, you know, the government talking very vocally about the need for climate action and wanting to use this conference as a kind of leader, you know, to present itself as a leader in climate action. On the other hand, opening up new oil fields in the North Sea.
I mean, well, it's literally gaslighting in the instance of opening up, you know, more gas sort of extraction in the process of this sort of, you know, bizarre greenwashing that's going ahead. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's kind of gaslighting the movement, gaslighting, you know, but I think what the interesting thing I think politically is clearly there's a sense that, at least in the UK, you know, you can't simply be like, oh, we're just going to do nothing. So I think the very fact that at least been a rhetorical gesture towards, you know, a green industrial revolution, and we're going to, you know, host a COP that's going to be the sort of envy of the world, etc., I think does point to some interesting sort of tectonic plates shifting politically that I think could be, you know, mobilized and sort of, you know, tipped in a sort of, you know, different and much more radical direction. But I think the North Sea in general in the round is really interesting sort of space of contestation, because, you know, the UK is still second largest oil and gas producer in the UK, and the fossil wealth of the North Sea is completely bound up in histories of financialization, of deindustrialization, a whole host of sort of really extractive and destructive trends. But then there's also,
just clarify that stat. You said that the UK is the second biggest fossil fuel producer in the UK, and I wondered if you meant
sorry in Europe. Yeah, sorry, it's this sort of, the UK is the second largest oil and gas producer in Europe, and even things like Cambo oil field, which I think you were kind of referencing, which for listeners is sort of it's an old field, but they're sort of planning to reopen it, and if they proceed on the sort of sort of proposed sort of extraction, it'll become the sort of fifth largest field in the continental shelf, and sort of the extraction from Cambo alone would kind of like bust through the UK's sort of notional sort of international contributions. But at the same time, the North Sea, there's this extraordinary communal power, which is of course wind and wave, and sort of like the flow of energy that actually sort of is renewable, and therefore lends itself to a very different political economy, non-extractive, communal, shared, if we can get the right infrastructures of ownership, of governance, of who has a stake and a say in it. And of course, then there's also really important questions around global supply chains, zones of sacrifice, where are the materials being extracted to build the renewable sort of wind farms, etc. But I think the North Sea, I think the fact that we're both sort of the second largest producer in Europe, and yet claiming to sort of lead the world, but also there's this sort of emerging radical potential that I think if it's privatized will go very badly wrong. But I think that it tells an interesting story of like the two potential trajectories the UK could take. But on your question about like these dual stories, I just think it's sort of greenwashing on a vast and sort of fairly dangerous scale. And
just give the report a plug if people want to go and read it or find out more. Where should they go?
Yeah, I'll put it in the chat in a minute. It's called Who Owns the North Sea? And you can go to common-wealth.co.uk and it'll be in the reports there, but I'll put it in the chat now. Oh, I think you muted yourself.
Muted, sorry. We've got a question from P. Splinter, Harpreet, about the role of China, and I thought you might have, and Kate, feel free to jump in on this as well, interesting thoughts on that. So I'm going to slightly rephrase the question, but how should we understand the issue of China in the context of the climate crisis? China and its rise economically has been one of the driving kind of factors in global political economy for the last decade at least. And obviously that's on the one hand increasingly true within the climate debate. It's also the case that China is often a scapegoat, and it's often sort of the final stage of climate denial is oh well, it's all the Chinese fault, so we don't need to do anything. So how do we kind of both understand that yes, the authoritarian capitalism China probably isn't something we should be defending, but on the other hand we don't want to shift blame away from the West, which is historically much more responsible?
I think you've answered the question yourself. But yes, I mean, to dig into that more deeply, the average person in China emits something like half the amount of carbon compared to the average person in the US on a yearly basis. It's energy reliance is hugely problematic. Its way of reliance on an economic growth system is hugely problematic. I'm not going to sit here and defend China in any way, but when thinking about the climate change issue from a historical perspective, it's one that we've known about for a very, very long time, that scientists from oil companies predicted with a really remarkable degree of accuracy that around this time we would be experiencing and witnessing the ferocity and how regular the storms, the floods, the wildfires, this level of sea level rise that we're seeing. And they knew this as early as the 70s and 80s and persisted with the level and scale of extraction that has by and large fostered a level of infrastructure resilience that is held by the North. So if you were to look, and Carbon Map have done this really interesting carbon map where they visualize the globe based on responsibility and impact. So when you look at it based on responsibility, the global North is bloated. And when you look at it in terms of impacts, huge impacts are going to be felt disproportionately in Asia and Africa, taking poverty into account. So again, you've got this historical context of disproportionate responsibility in the North, a continuing context where China makes a lot of the goods that we're wearing and using to be together here today. And yet, when we're thinking about its emissions, often they're logged and held as emissions that China is responsible for. And I think that that is really crucial. And when we're looking, this is where I think we can talk about numbers, but also, I think Matt said earlier, have to move away from numbers as well, because there's a way of talking about UK action on climate change that's a very positive story. And when you take into account the things that we're using, we've actually made very nominal reductions. And when we're talking about potentially opening new coal mines, expanding oil and gas, we're going against what even John Kerry and the head of the IEA are saying that we need to do. And so, yeah, gaslighting for sure. And I think pointing the finger at countries like China and India in that context is a big part of the problem, and that we really need to be making sure we're not supporting, investing, having our banks investing in fossil fuel infrastructure, having our government allow extraction. There's a great Stop Cambo campaign going on by Friends of the Earth Scotland and Uplift, and joining those calls and making sure that we're not incurring more climate debt. We've used over and above the level of space in the atmosphere for our fair share of emissions, and we need to address that fact first.
Thanks, Harpreet. And Kate, kind of continuing on the theme of what you might say is the kind of geopolitics of climate and coming into this big conversation we're going to be having about it. Obviously, the relationship between the US and China has been a big question in politics in the US over the last year in particular. And I'd genuinely be interested to hear, how the US climate movement interacts with that. It's very common to have this debate about China, but how does that interact with the rest of the debate about China? Obviously, famously Trump was a big kind of basher of China as a concept. And, how do you, as the kind of US left and climate movement, interact with that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, and this is, the tragedy of just how little, I think the US tends to value internationalism. Even, our left tends to be a little parochial in terms of, how we think about the rest of the world. So I don't know if there's a great, language around it yet. I do think what's encouraging is that, groups like the Sunrise Movement, a group called People's Action, which folks may or may not be familiar with, which is based here, led, a letter basically, calling out this like really sort of jingoistic language on behalf of that's coming out of the Biden administration vis-a-vis China, which, I would agree wholeheartedly with everything Harpreet said. I'm not going to go to bat for China, not, a good actor on the world stage. Certainly, but I think we've seen this sort of bizarre continuation, right, from the Trump administration, which was really, sort of aggressive and in countering. I like the phrase "China as a concept," but we've seen a sort of slight variation on that with Biden, where he's looking to enlist a sort of multilateral force against China as a concept as well. And I think there are any number of ways you could sort of read that, right? The US handled the coronavirus pandemic terribly, has a bit of a bruised ego and sort of looking to rebuild its own national brand, as it were. And so, sees China as a venue to do that. And the US just, does not have a great track record of doing very big, good things domestically without being mobilized against some foreign threat. right? And that's, taken a real spectrum let's look at a spectrum of ways, right? From World War II, where, that was a very different context. But, we, are an empire, right? We have military bases spread out around the world. And that is a sort of language that US policymakers, regardless of whether they're Republicans or Democrats, are sort of comfortable talking about. And something that's, a bit disconcerting, I think, in the way that the Biden administration has sort of talked about climate change, is to imagine it as, being the sort of like venue for American greatness, right? That we're going to dominate world export markets and build up our, big, strong electric vehicle sector here. That will be the sort of driving tip of the spear of the climate crisis. And it's just, it's really far off, right, from what we know we need to do. It's not, we're not going to solve the climate crisis by building some more electric cars. Not that, some more electric cars wouldn't be helpful, right? We drive a lot here. But that is a wholly different project than the main work, right? Which is, decarbonizing as quickly as possible, transforming our grid system, building up massive amounts of renewable energy, and making a transition off of fossil fuels possible, right, for the rest of the world that we have gotten very rich off of. And I think some of the ways that the White House and members of Congress and Democratic members of Congress talk about sort of building a national will around that project, I think is unhelpfully bringing in this really kind of jingoistic attitude toward China that's like totally unnecessary, right? We had, this thing called the Endless Frontiers Act passed a couple of months ago, which, in some ways was, or it got folded into this much bigger package, but contained a lot of fairly, standard, like, I wouldn't quite call it industrial policy, but funding for research and development into things that are, completely fine. Some funding for sort of domestic manufacturing, ensuring up supply chain. Pretty uncontroversial stuff, but framed in this language of total, conflict with China and like global competition that seems totally unhinged. But I think, more kind of broadly, I think the U.S. has taken this is most extreme when it comes to China, but I do think in general, the U.S. has this approach which comes out pretty strongly when it comes to climate politics, of sort of going around and like wagging our fingers at other countries and saying, how dare you, be extracting coal, oil, and gas. We don't want you to do that, and get your act together or else something, right? We've left global agreements twice. We don't have much of a credible, ledge to stand on in that regard. But still, you see like John Kerry going around the world, like telling world governments, to get their act together. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has approved more oil and gas permits on public lands than any administration since George W. Bush, right? We are a prolific exporter of fossil fuels, right? And continue just to drill an enormous amount, and that remains a third rail in climate politics, even sort of the progressive end of climate politics, questioning, our role as a major exporter of fossil fuels. Is a third rail, despite the fact that we only repealed the crude oil export ban that had been in place for 40 years in 2015, right? That's very recent memory, and could be reinstated again. So I just, whether it comes to China or other countries, I just think there's a pretty limited effect that John Kerry kind of globetrotting around as the U.S. climate envoy, telling other countries to get in line. I just don't think that has a big effect on other countries, and I think that we should probably get our act together internally, right? For I think moral reasons, but also just for pragmatic reasons. Why is anyone going to trust the U.S. At a venue like COP26 if there isn't some good faith effort made domestically to start working toward keeping warming below 2 degrees and hopefully 1.5.
Thank you, Kate. And I'm going to, so we're kind of beginning to run out of time. I'm going to finish by asking you each, just in a couple of minutes each, to answer the question in the title, given that I've not asked it to you yet, which is COP26 humanity's make or break moment on climate breakdown? Now, I know you're not going to, you know, say that this is going to be the moment the world's saved. But can you give me a sense, as you're observing proceedings at COP26 and the run up to it and so on, of what kind of signs you'll be looking out for, what you'll be hoping for to get from it, even if it's, you know, not transformation of the world in one, you know, summit in a conference centre in Glasgow? And Harpreet, why didn't you come first this time?
No, COP26 is not a make or break moment in my view. I think that it is a moment for our movements to build our collective voice and power to come together and form our networks. And if you've never participated in your local Green New Deal group or Friends of the Earth group or whatever group it is that is doing good stuff in your local area, it's the time to get involved and try and imagine the type of world that isn't so reliant on extractivism and exploitation together. And if it can act as a moment to spur more people into healthy, thriving, nourishing movement groups, they do exist, then it can be part of the transition that we absolutely need in the world. So my hope is it will nourish and act as a whirlwind to grow the broad base of people power that we need to move to a democratic, thriving, justice-centered transition.
Thank you, Harpreet. And in that context, do you want to give us a quick plug for your new organisation? How can people find out more about it?
Sure. tippingpointuk.org, we are hoping to support grassroots groups that are broadly working towards climate justice. We are going to be creating lots of tech infrastructure that groups can speak to each other across and within, but also have just recruited an amazing group of climate activists, from union organisers to youth strikers, that are kind of at your disposal, ready to help you build or join or find a grassroots campaign that speaks to you. So yeah, join us.
Cool, thanks, Harpreet. And Matt, why don't we come to you and then we'll finish with Kate. So Matt, is it the make or break moment? And what are you going to be following, watching closely for, etc.?
So I mean, on that first part, you know, very much echo what Harpreet said, and in some ways I do think you know, this temptation to have very sort of binary moments in sort of the narrativization of climate crisis, like this is the moment to save it, is actually quite unhelpful in a way, not least because every sort of 0.1 degrees we can sort of stop from rising makes a huge amount of difference. And so there's no, like, you know, sort of cut-off point between complete catastrophe and, oh, everything's all right, because everything's not all right for hundreds of millions of people already. But, you know, I think as Harpreet really articulated, you know, that ability to cohere and build and, you know, emerge out of it with sort of social movement strengthened and networks empowered. I mean, I think, look at, you know, what might be interesting beneath the bonnet. I mean, I think, you know, the headline agreements, you know, we know won't go fast enough, far enough, or be fair enough. But I think that, you know, what might be interesting is in a series of, like, quite, you know, in some ways like unsexy topics, but nonetheless in terms of emissions are hugely important. So for example, if you take something like cement and steel, which is in some ways sounds quite boring, but in some ways is like the fabric of much of our world, it's about 15% of total emissions. And you can kind of see, you know, people might say, well, actually we need to do this. This obviously to some degree obviously is geopolitical, and there's power interests at play and everything, of course, but to some degree, you know, in Sweden there's an interesting publicly owned sort of steel company working with the Finnish government, or might be the other way around, Finnish government working with a Sweden, you know, a Scandinavian sort of, you know, approach, which is developing one of the first fossil fuel free steel plants. And of course the answer is not, you know, much like EVs, it's not just sort of take today's economy and decarbonize it, it's to build out from fossil capitalism a very different economy, but we'll probably still need steel and probably need some cement. So it's about, can we emerge with COP in those some specific areas with really radically enhanced roadmaps and binding agreements around, you know, fossil fuel free steel by 2035, support for the resourcing for the global south to sort of, build fossil fuel free steel, a green new steel, if you will. If you won't, don't worry, because that's a bad pun. And I'll leave it on that because I probably can't top that. But yeah, so something like that.
That was yeah, good to have a terrible pun there, Matt. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but thank you very much. And Kate, I know you've given your views on COP already, but I'm going to ask you for them again. And I think we all know what you're going to say, but to the first half, easy to make a break moment. But how should we understand COP and how should we follow it? As a kind of media circus. For those of you who won't, I'm going to try and be there myself. But for those of you who won't, what things you'll be looking out for? What things people try to understand from it and take hope or not from?
Yeah, I mean, I would answer like Harpreet and Matt. It's not a make or break moment for all the reasons they already said. Yeah, I mean, the thing I find, I've attended a bunch of these climate talks and I find them sort of like psychic horrors to attend in person. Like you're in a sort of sensory deprivation tank and there's like weird things happening all around you. That's going as a reporter. I can't imagine what it's like to actually go as like a participant. But yeah, so it's a pretty disorienting space. And I think in some ways it's easier to track from outside than inside just because you're inundated with information all the time. So, one thing that I'm going to be tracking, and I think, I hope this is a sort of main story of the COP beyond sort of like the palace intrigue stuff of like who's, which diplomats showing up and what are they saying, is that I think there's a lot of just really palpable anger, right, about the like profound disconnect between the North and the South. In the last year. I mean, people are coming to COP who may or may not be vaccinated, whose countries may not have gotten access to the vaccine, as countries like mine have hoarded it. And so I think that will all sort of play in a couple of really fascinating ways. I mean, I think that was already true at the last talks that were held in 2019, right, where there was a massive demonstration about equitable climate financing that resulted in like the conference center in Madrid like raising a wall and physically kicking people out of the conference space, including Harpreet. Were you there? Oh wow. Okay, cool. I had like left.
Meant my partner got to come home early, which was quite nice.
Oh wow. So who knows if we'll see something like that again. But I think the sort of particular conversation about vaccine apartheid has raised could potentially shine a light on what have been some pretty like arcane, not arcane, but like really sort of niche subjects that have been longstanding demands from the G77, things like technology transfer, right? Making low carbon technologies, life-saving technologies accessible to folks in the global South and not, bound up behind, patents and these like thickets of international agreements. So, I hope that conversation can sort of emerge and, it will be up to enterprising journalists to make them sort of rise above the headlines of the usual sort of faff around these events.
Well, that's us. That's our time. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for their wisdom and thoughts. Thank you to everyone who's joined us, both here on Zoom, but also over on Facebook and all the other various places people are dialing in or tuning in or whatever you're doing in these days. I feel old now. I feel like you don't dial in at all, do you? Who does that? Who dials a phone ever? But anyway, thank you. On Open Democracy, we're going to be covering the run up to COP closely, and we're going to be thinking about all these things that our lovely panelists have told us. And if you want to see more of that, then please do support us. We rely on donations from our readers, and the link for that is in the chat. So if you have, well, ideally lots of money lying around, then give it to us. But if you have a little money lying around, you can give us that too. Thank you so much. And we'll see you at next week's discussion. So see you then, and enjoy your evening or your morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. So thanks to Matt, thanks to Harpreet, thanks to Kate, and thanks to all of you.
Thanks, everyone.